I am today. My field in a larger sense is the field known as behavioral medicine. And I've been in that field ever since, several years after I got my PhD many years ago. And I really had no interest in breathing. It wasn't a subject that ever really crossed my mind. And I had a lot of misconceptions about breathing myself. I thought it was all about getting enough oxygen, and it was about relaxation and that kind of thing, or meditation or yoga and that kind of thing. And I sort of dropped it with that and never really went anywhere with it until 1984, when a friend of mine, he had a grant, a $2 million grant to look at behavioral variables in epilepsy. And he ended up focusing on breathing. And he ended up publishing 7 papers on breathing and epilepsy, where he found that a lot of people with epilepsy would start to overventilate. That is, a lot of people think of it as hyperventilation. It's really much more than that on the one hand and much less than that on another hand. But he found that these people suffering with these kinds of seizures were hyperventilating slightly or moderately just before they had their seizures. And so he wondered whether breathing might have something to do with the probability of having a seizure. And sure enough, within a very short time, he published these papers and very conclusively found that the way you breathe when you start to encounter a seizure situation has a dramatic effect on whether that seizure actually occurs. And he found that some people were able to prophylactically block seizures 100%. Other people had no success at all, and yet most people were in between. Now, why would that be true? Well, the fact is that if you overventilate, you lose carbon dioxide, and that's a problem. You know, carbon dioxide is precious to the body. You need to maintain exactly the correct level of carbon dioxide at all times, and that's done through reflexes, through chemoregulatory reflexes in the brainstem, where the respiration is regulated. So when you try to take over the breathing, you get involved in your breathing, you tend to disrupt those mechanisms and you can get into trouble. So these people suffering with the epileptic seizures would get involved in their breathing to some extent, deregulate, lose carbon dioxide, and that would trigger vasoconstriction in the brain so that there would be an oxygen deficit as a consequence, a glucose deficit, and other changes in electrolyte considerations, which would set the stage for the seizure. So if you disengage that kind of breathing, then you essentially avoided exacerbating your seizure problem, or you could avoid the triggering altogether, thereby reducing the probability of the seizure. Now, depending on who you are and what kind of epilepsy issues you have, how severe it is, how common it is, one person may be always on the edge of the threshold. So when you change the breathing, you drop below a threshold and there's no seizure. Whereas the next person may be way above the threshold, so that even by maximizing the availability of oxygen and glucose, you still have the seizures. So it's a variable that interacts with whatever organic challenge that person is dealing with.
Wow.
So in one case, the breathing is very helpful, and maybe in another case, it's not helpful at all. And
Yeah.
that's how I got into it at that time. Again, the breathing here is a behavior. This is something someone learns. We all have breathing habits. Okay, just like we have postural habits, like the way I'm moving my hands right now. Look at that. I'm moving my fingers towards my chest. This is a habit of mine. I'm expressing myself. Look what I'm doing with my hands. Look at my head, moving my head. Look what happens with my eyes. Look what I'm doing with my hands now. Okay, these are all things that are learned unconsciously. They're all postures. And breathing is no exception. We have all kinds of postures. And those postures serve us in certain ways. Like this, and moving my hands serves me in communicating. Breathing in certain ways can assist you in all kinds of ways. For example, some people who may be suffering with trauma, who have problems with, they keep remembering certain things, they have emotional kinds of triggers all around them because of some traumatic experience. if they change their breathing where they can reduce blood flow to the brain, they can disconnect, they can dissociate, and they can avoid the things around them. So the habit, the outcome of that kind of breathing can be extremely reinforcing, where the person, every time they feel some kind of a threat, they breathe that way and they disconnect.
Wow.
So you change the brain state in doing that.
Wow. So Peter, so just to, there's a lot in there. So I want to just back up a little bit. So, so you mentioned before chemoreceptors, and so we're looking at, that's a chemical change in the brain, is what you're talking about? Is that,
Well,
that's regulates breathing?
I'll tell you precisely. However, I'm just going to finish one thing in regards to my background. That's how I got into it. Partly was through the work of my friend and his research grant at the International Center for the Disabled in New York. And then I came across some statistics which will factor back into what you just asked me about.
Yeah.
And that is that you studies, lots of surveys out there, and there was a whole number of surveys that were summarized in one report, where it was determined that about 60% of the ambulance runs in the major cities of the United States are a result of acute symptoms brought on by the way someone's breathing.
Wow.
It can precipitate such profound kinds of physiological changes and the symptoms associated with those that people call, we call them United States 911, which is the emergency number to get an ambulance. Okay, now those kinds of statistics also had a profound effect on my interest, because I realized at that point that there are so many people out there. In fact, in this country, we're talking about tens of millions of people who suffer from radical symptoms brought on by the way they're breathing. And then they don't know what to do with those symptoms. Just like when we all have symptoms, we try to come up with an explanation. Why do I have a fever? Why do I have pain in my belly? You know, why do I have these symptoms? And so they go to their knowledge base, and they use that knowledge base as a kind of explanation. Or they go to the doctor, or they go to a therapist of some kind. They read a book or something, and then they kind of come up with a hypothesis as to why they have those symptoms, and they may even come up with those explanations with the doctor they're visiting or some other healthcare practitioner.
Wow.
And these explanations may have virtually nothing to do with the source of the problem. Most people it would never occur to them that it had anything to do with the way they're breathing.
Wow.
So they blame it on something else. And they go to the doctor who has a specialized kind of knowledge about something, and the doctor obviously is going to go to his or her knowledge base to try to figure out what's going on. They do the best they can. They come up with an explanation. Maybe you get a drug prescription. Maybe you get some kind of self-help technique, whatever it is to try to help out. Then someone else is a naturopath. Someone else is a physical therapist. Someone else is, a mental health counselor. And they all have their take on it, but no one really is focusing on, in these cases, as to what's really going on. Most of these people don't know their respiratory physiology on the one hand, or if they do know respiratory physiology, they generally don't know anything about counseling, interviewing, psychology, behavior, or anything like that. So this immense number of people fall through the cracks and rarely get what they need and walk around with those problems for years, decades at a time.
So Peter,
that's how I got into it.
That is brilliant.
That's so much. I want to come back to
resonate a lot with that too.
I want to come back to the chemical part. Right. But there's a question that just popped up. So because in this day and age, people are getting so highly specialized in their fields. You've got all the fields in science and physiology and all these popping up. Is it, what got missed where breathing kind of is a small part of many fields, but they've not been able to pull it all together.
Correct.
Why have we missed this?
Well, that's the whole problem. The reason it's overlooked is because of these silos. And when we go to the university, we get our degrees, we do our dissertations, we become extremely specialized. And we may do very good work in what we do. but rarely do we know much about what's going on in allied fields. Even within our own professions, we don't know very well what's going on in these different areas. Like in my field, maybe personality theory is your field. Maybe you're a clinical psychologist. Maybe sleep disorders is what your work is about. Maybe most of your work is around neurophysiology. Maybe you're a human factors person and you design aircraft cockpits. Where do you put the altimeter to avoid having an accident when you land a plane? That happened to be a special area of interest of mine. I was a pilot for many, many years, so I got very involved in that. I can tell you all kinds of stories about breathing and aviation.
Oh, fabulous.
So, in any event, you were asking about the reflex mechanisms and
yes.
so on.
Yeah.
Okay, and getting to that one of the things that we try to get at when we work with people with dysfunctional breathing is to teach them about allowing the breath. Now, that isn't necessarily a solution, because when you allow the breath, you may be allowing a bad habit, because bad habits are learned unconsciously. Habits are automatic. That's the whole idea of a habit. So it happens automatically. You don't have to think about it. Like when you walk or chew food, you don't have to think about it. And that's the way habits are. And they're very specific, like chewing food in your mouth. If you don't do it exactly correctly, guess what happens? You're in trouble. And all habits are very specific. They all have triggers. They all have outcomes. And so when you look at breathing behavior, you're interested in the trigger for the habit, the outcome, and the outcome is what sustains it. Now, those regulatory mechanisms are what you want to have online working for you. So a lot of times the techniques that we use in breathing get in the way of those regulatory mechanisms, and then our unconscious habits, like our postures, or how we're sitting in a chair or something, that the breathing postures get in the way of those reflexes. But the reflexes are the following. Okay, now there are lots of reflexes that have to do with, say, irritants getting in the lungs or something like that. But there are basic reflexes that regulate respiration from moment to moment, breath to breath. And there are three considerations here, and there are two different locations. One location is arterial, and you're looking at receptor sites in the aorta or receptor sites in the carotid arteries. And there's three kinds of them. One is sensitive to the pH of the plasma of the blood. One is sensitive to the oxygen, partial pressure oxygen, as we say, that is the oxygen concentration, the oxygen tension in the arterial system. And then another receptor site that is sensitive to the carbon dioxide concentration or tension in the arterial system. And then through the autonomic nervous system, that information arrives in the brainstem, which we'll come back to in a moment. But there is another location, which is in the brain, and that is there are receptor sites that are located right around those specialized respiratory centers in the brainstem. And the pH of the cerebral spinal fluid, the pH of the interstitial fluids, that is the fluids around the cells and so on, those receptor sites are sensitive to the pH of those fluids. And also, they're sensitive to the CO2 concentration in those fluids. They're not sensitive to oxygen concentration, only pH, only carbon dioxide concentration. Okay, the thing that you respond to in the brain really is, when you feel air hunger, has to do with the accumulation of carbon dioxide. That higher level of carbon dioxide really creates air hunger, in very, very quickly.
Now, air hunger, that's when you feel like you can't get a good breath in, right?
That you can't get enough oxygen, let's say.
Yes.
Because that would be a subset of that. You feel like you can't get enough air in. And one thing to realize about air hunger is it's not just, this is so important, you see. Air hunger, it's a psychological thing. It's not just physical. The physiology is behavioral. All of it is behavioral. I specialized for years in blood sugar regulation and learning, and how there are all kinds of learning mechanisms that regulate hunger or regulate different levels of blood sugar. And when you really think about it, the way an animal navigates in its environment is the hunger that is responsible for its looking for food is based on the animal's experience and where it lives. So the hunger shows up in that creature at the right time so that it will eat the food that's available. So that flexibility is critical to the survival of a creature, that it can regulate its motivations. Its motivations are learned, and air hunger is no exception. For a lot of people, you put a blanket over the top of their head and they feel air hunger, how quickly? In seconds.
Yes.
You go into a closet and it's dark in there, they feel air hunger. This ain't got nothing to do with oxygen concentration. And it doesn't have anything to do with carbon dioxide concentration.
Mm-hmm.
It's a learned phenomenon. Air hunger obviously is biological, but biology is unto itself. It is a psychological kind of a thing.
Mm.
It's motivated. That's why all these biological systems collect data, and they organize the data, they save the data, and they use the data. That's what makes basic life forms different from the stone that's sitting there next to the creature. It self-regulates, it learns, it takes in information, it's programmable. And breathing is programmed. And air hunger is a programmed kind of a thing.
Mm.
If you don't understand that, then you can't really understand what's happening physiologically. You can't really understand the problem. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Can I ask a question about air hunger versus like feeling, because, you know, we've referenced, like, you know, when you feel like you're hungry and you go rummaging through the cupboards and you have cravings, like, is that really like cravings to eat something, or is that air hunger, thinking that's like a physiological trigger that's causing a psychological thing that you go to what you know, which is like rummaging around in the cupboards for junky food? Like,
see, that provides the motivation, the hunger, the change in the blood sugar level motivates you. And then you do certain things for which there's an outcome. You know, you have the ice cream in your mouth. Like, I love ice cream. You know, you have ice cream in your mouth. Next thing you know. And it's the same thing with breathing. Breathing it's a complex kind of a consideration. We breathe for all kinds of reasons. Like right now, I'm breathing to be able to communicate with you guys, because I'm talking. Without the air, I'm not going to be able to talk. So that is one very important objective of breathing, is to be able to communicate. Okay, and there are all kinds of objectives for breathing that have nothing to do with respiration. And those objectives can essentially run counter to the respiratory objective. And then you end up in trouble. And you end up with symptoms, and you don't know where those symptoms are coming from, and you start looking for a reason, and so does everybody else.
Peter, well, I want to ask. So, Peter, if our system is in fact so what I'm hearing is our system becomes affected by the environment around us, and a combination of our body chemistry as well. So we can have environmental factors. What, like, is it the fact that we're not living in an environment that allows us to actually regulate our breathing properly, or why do people have so many dysfunctions, like you know, behavioral parts of it and all of that? If you understand my question on that.
Behavioral and mechanics.
Well, it's a question of degrees of freedom.
Okay.
The more the degrees of freedom, the more mistakes you can make. That's the downside of being free. You can make a bad choice. Okay? And behavior's that way. It's probabilistic. And the system is an amazing system, and what it learns in the short term may work against it in the long term. Take something very simple, kind of a silly example, but I always like it, where you're looking at some very fundamental biological learning, which is psychological. Let's say you have a young rabbit that's just been out and about for a short time, and it encounters a fox, and it almost is eaten, killed, and it escapes. Guess what? It's afraid of foxes for how long?
Its whole life.
No, not very long.
Its whole life.
It's like that.
Its whole life. And every time it sees a fox, what does it do?
Runs.
It leaves. And the habit stays in place forever. Okay? And we say this is a smart rabbit. It learned quickly and efficiently. On the other hand, if we take a fox now, when it was a young fox, it got kicked in the face by a bunny, and now it's afraid of rabbits. What do we say about that? Now this fox, when it's afraid of its food, it's afraid to go hunting rabbits, and we call it a phobia. And we say the fox is neurotic, and we say the fox is kind of a little crazy, and we say the fox is dysfunctional. It's exactly the same thing that's been learned. There's no difference. It's just who learned it. The rabbit learned it on one occasion, the fox on the other. In one case it was functional and served the creature, and the other one it worked against the creature. So whether it's dysfunctional or not has to do with how it serves the creature. One creature we say is healthy, and the other creature we say is mentally disabled in some way, you see. Can't even hunt a rabbit as a fox.
Something's wrong with it. Yeah.
You're not a real fox unless you can hunt rabbits, So
that's so fascinating.
A diminished fox.
Yes. So can I also ask the question too, because this is been something that's been in our space around, like it didn't start with you, like so the fox had an experience with the rabbit, but what if like the fox's parents had the experience with the rabbit? Does it then pass down those behaviors?
Yeah, you see, then it gets more complicated, and you get other kinds of learning. You see, you get vicarious learning. So the parent is fearful, and because the parent is fearful, now the rabbit becomes afraid because, oh my God, my mother is afraid, and now they're afraid because they think their mother is somehow vulnerable. And so now whenever they see a rabbit, they're afraid themselves without actually having to been attacked by a fox. And that's by metaphor. So a lot of what you see in breathing is based on metaphor. For example, a woman I'll take a woman who's pregnant, for example, and struggles with the breathing because the diaphragm, there's tremendous pressure in the diaphragm, and she's always reaching for the air. And so she develops this habit of reaching for the air. And now, after the child is born and later on, when she finds herself in a challenging situation, that may be a metaphor for what was happening to her when she was pregnant. So now she reaches for air when she's not pregnant, but when she's being challenged somehow. Maybe challenged with her child, or challenged with some kind of an argument with her husband about the child. And so she reaches for air the same way that she did when she was pregnant, and that leads to deregulation of those reflexes, and she gets all kinds of symptoms like being completely dizzy and disoriented and can't remember what she's going to say, and she can't carry on a good argument. Or normally she might have defeated her husband completely in any kind of argument. Now she can't because she doesn't have enough oxygen in the brain.
Wow.
I'm giggling because I feel like I've been there before.
So Peter is learning to calibrate, or is learning to calibrate your breathing the thing that we need to learn in order to.
Well, ultimately, it's not about learning to calibrate your brain. It's your breathing. It's learning to allow it. If in fact, when you do allow it, the body doesn't engage in a dysfunctional behavior, in which case the therapist or the educator, we don't think of a therapist, it's education, is that the coach, the educator, the analyst works together with the client and the client's body. So it's a three-way proposition. The client is working with their body and with themselves, and so is the educator coach working with those two beings as well.
So it's an integration.
So it's an integration.
Okay.
It's not just about what you have learned, Shane, but it's about what you've set your body up to learn without realizing it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay? So, but ultimately the goal is to let those reflexes operate, unless there's some brain damage or, some kind of organic problem that's related to, respiratory drive and that kind of thing. That's another whole issue, but that's a rare thing. So most of the time you're talking about habits that people have learned or the body has learned, but it's disturbing those reflexes. And so the idea is that, for example, if you focus on the exhale, one of many, many things we do, I'll just give you an example. You have a person focus on the exhale, and you start by saying something like this. Think of your body as a friend, and you're interested in knowing how your friend is breathing. You're not trying to show me how well you breathe. You're not trying to prove to yourself that you know good breathing because someone taught you to breathe in your diaphragm. You just want to see how your friend breathes. What does your friend do? Can you do that? Can you just sit back and see what your body's going to do by itself? Let's see. So we'll start with something like that. Then I'll have the person focus on the exhale, and I'll tell them a little about the exhale. Sitting in this chair right now, your exhale is a passive process. There's no need to use a muscle. It's a question of relaxing the muscles you've used to take the breath. Now, are you actually doing that? So I'd like you to focus on the breath. I'd like you to watch the breath going out. I'm not doing this with you. I'm just kind of,
I'm breathing now.
So you watch the breath go out, and I want you to notice whether there's any pushing. Does it seem to be pushed out, or does it go out slow? Because normally it'll just go out slow. As you relax the inspiratory muscles, the breath will just go out slowly, and it'll get slower and slower, and then stop. Obviously, it has to stop before you can take a breath. And it's going to stop for how long? It's going to stop until the reflex kicks in. The inhalation reflex, the inspiratory reflex will kick in. And if you're really, observant, you can feel it. So as it comes and it stops, and you can feel it come. Now, a lot of people have lost that, you see. They take the breath before the reflex operates. And they believe they have to take the breath. They have to do it the right way. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. They feel like they have to do it. Okay? So now they're allowing it. See, they're distrustful of a system, but they allow it. They find that reflex. You can start to work with them to build trust. And that may be a metaphor for other things in their lives as well.
Yeah, that's just what you said. I just want to highlight that, Peter, because that is a huge one. People not trusting their breath or their body.
They aren't trusting their body. So now I have them focus on whether it's being pushed or not. Because if you push the breath, guess what you're going to do at the end of the breath? You're going to reach for a big breath. And if you do that, you get into trouble right away.
So that's putting that goes back to you putting the system out of balance. So then
that's right, because when you take that big breath and you let the air out, you're going to lose too much carbon dioxide, and then you start to move into this carbon dioxide deficiency state where you're going to get symptoms. So that's what we call the chemistry. The pH and all of that is called the chemistry of breathing, which is the respiratory side. And the mechanics of it, like taking a deep breath, that's the mechanical side. So if you allow the breath out, not pushing it, and wait for that reflex, the chances are the inhale is going to be very small.
So
which
Peter,
is good.
Peter, I want to ask a question about pH. Now, so your breathing obviously regulates blood pH and changes it. Do other factors like perhaps having a really acidic diet or doing other things that changes the body pH, does that affect the breathing as well?
When you say the body pH, you see, for me, all kinds of bells ring. What in the hell does that mean? It's the first question that comes to mind. What are they talking about? pH of what? The body has all kinds of places with different fluids and secretions and everything. Where? pH where? If you're talking about pH in the blood, the pH in the blood ain't going to change, as we say in the vernacular here. The pH is not going to change at all if you're allowing the breathing. It's not going to change no matter what you eat. That's breathing's job. It regulates pH. If the pH is shifting because you're eating some kind of a food and the breathing doesn't correct it, then you ain't breathing properly. The breathing is a reflex mechanism that regulates the pH. That's what it does. From moment to moment, it's regulating that pH. Anything that comes in there that alters that pH, the breathing immediately changes to restore it to where it's supposed to be.
So that was my, I think that clarified my question, because a lot of people go on about pH and blood pH. I mean, we've been to breathing things where people are saying, look, the pH changed. That being said, there's a lot of people that are concerned about that. So I like how you clarified that. So what you're saying is that it affects blood pH, your breathing, that's its job, right? So it doesn't, people that are kind of worried about, oh, how's my pH if I eat this kind of food? Your breathing's just always going to be there to correct it.
Absolutely.
Unless you've got like a mechanical problem, which, it sounds to me like, if somebody's controlling their exhale and forcing their exhale out, causing the breathing dysfunction,
snatching
it, to me, that's like anger or fear, on one side or the other, panic. So what are some of the recommendations to, if somebody's got a breathing dysfunction, like they snatch their inhale or they force their exhale? Is it the first thing we go to? Is that like reprogramming the automatic breath?
It is. You've touched on a number of things there, and it certainly is reprogramming, no question. It's not that people, the kind of person you just described, is breathing that way all the time. People generally have all kinds of breathing habits, and they breathe differently in all kinds of circumstances. And the physiology has been designed, so to speak, to operate well in all circumstances. Whether you're anxious and stressed, or whether you're bored or excited or sleepy or whatever it is, that's going to regulate if you let it do so. And it's these habits that get in the way. And so if you give someone some technique of some kind, that may be not useful, because if you haven't addressed the habit, it doesn't make any difference. Like, for example, if I have dysfunctional breathing because I don't want to remember something, so I overventilate to kind of disconnect, dissociate, feel like I would on a drug. You talk about something like holotropic breathing, like Stan Grof's work, or all these kinds of, rebirthing and things like that. You're changing neurophysiology when you do these things. So if I'm changing my neurophysiology so that it brings me to a state that I like to be in, teaching me diaphragmatic breathing, what's that got to do with it? Nothing. Teaching me slow breathing, what's that got to do with it? Nothing. I may know everything about breathing, but that hasn't anything to do with my dysfunctional problem. Mm-hmm. I may breathe in front of you the precisely correct way. So what? Someone who has a problem with aggression, with their arms, and they hit people and hurt people, they can do all the normal things with their hands. They can demonstrate all kinds of things. And then they can do the violent, crazy things they do. The fact that you can breathe well because you're an expert doesn't mean a damn thing. It's really about the habits that you have. That's what it's about. If you don't address a habit, it's not going to go away.
Now, like what you said about control, because it seems to me those that have the most control or desire for control have the greatest breathing dysfunctions, because they won't allow the breath to I like what you said about allowing the breath.
Tension in the body.
Yeah, too much tension in the
body.
Well,
that's a very big subject, because a person can be somebody, for example, I could demonstrate all this great kind of breathing, and through different control breathing, very, very slowly, and breathing very, very rapidly, and breathing in all these different ways, but have very good respiration doing all that. And you could be impressed with that. Or you could be this, like, what's his name? I just was in a conference with him the other day. I'm blocking on his name. He can hold his breath for 22 minutes underwater.
Oh, yes.
Stig
Severance.
Stig,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because you were
Yeah, I
on
was
10.
just in a meeting, it was a meeting of 100 people on Zoom, when he was on a panel that I was on, and we had talk and so on. Just because you can do that kind of thing and so on doesn't mean that you don't have a dysfunctional breathing problem. You can be someone who knows all about controlling the breathing, and you can allow it. You can do both. You can intentionally change your breath, but always know your chemistry is right by developing a sensitivity for that chemical change. So you can manipulate your breathing, but always know that that chemical axis is stable. We call it a chemical axis. The chemical axis is stable while you're changing the mechanics. And if you're good at that, that means that you're in touch with that chemistry, and what's regulating your breathing is the feelings associated with the chemistry. So no matter what you're doing on other levels, you're keeping that chemistry where it needs to be. Okay? So you could do both. I mean, you can get in there and be involved in it or not.
So Peter, we're coming back to the behavior part. What you're saying is, it's all good and well to be able to take over your breath and be able to do all these things and balance your chemistry, know where you are, but ultimately it's when you're not noticing your breath or not controlling your breath that's important, right? That's the behaviors
Correct.
that are
So
there.
those are your habits, which you want to be unconscious. You don't have to. Do you want to be consciously focused on your breathing? That's the only way it's going to be good?
No.
Or you're going to introduce a specific technique every hour to make sure your breath is good? No, it's something.
So Peter, what are the things?
Yeah.
So what are the things that we look for, or the processes that we look for to either remove poor habits, poor unconscious breathing habits, and install new ones? What are the recommendations that you usually do to do that? Or where do you start?
See, we put together a whole master's degree on this subject.
Which we're
getting
going to
there.
go through.
We're getting
yes.
there. And we have diploma program, we have certification programs. What we do is we do a behavioral analysis.
Yes.
So you take someone who's breathing, and there are many aspects of the breathing, mechanical aspects like the depth of the breath, the speed, the rate of the breathing, the locus of the breathing, the nose, the mouth, the chest, the diaphragm. You can look at gasping, you can look at breath holding, you can look at endless kinds of behaviors. Okay, if you do, what we do is a breathing behavior analysis where we identify a dysfunctional habit, which means it's not a question of how fast the person is breathing, for example. It's about how is the breathing serving them. Are they getting the oxygen they need? Are they regulating the pH? Are they breathing in a way that doesn't disrupt muscle functioning in other parts of the body? For example, are they breathing so they're biting every time they breathe? And then that biting is triggering a headache? And that biting is triggering a TMJ issue? That biting is affecting the growth in the jaw, around questions around the teeth and so on, developing orthodontic issues. Is it exacerbating the way you're breathing? It's exacerbating an anxiety issue you have? Is it getting in the way of your learning in class because you're overventilating in class and you can't remember what the teacher's talking about? And you can't read a book because you can't remember anything. And when you take a test, you just completely black out because you don't remember anything. How, is the breathing dysfunctional? What is it that's dysfunctional? What symptoms is the breathing responsible for? How is the breathing interacting with other considerations, organic considerations, and other things that you've learned? How is it playing a role in your life in terms of its interaction with other things? So we identify the elements of the breathing. We identify the triggers for habits that you may have learned when you were born. It may have been learned when you were 5 years old. You can learn them anytime. I remember I worked with a guy who was a track star at UCLA, He was their #1 guy in their track team, very well-known guy. He went through surgery on his ankle, came out, and he couldn't run anymore. He had a breathing problem. When he came out of the general anesthesia, he had a problem recovering. And he took that into his sport, and he hadn't been able to run in 6 months. I worked with him for about 4 weeks, and he was over it completely. He had developed a phobia. He had a phobia that was embedded in the breath. And you can learn these things just like that.
Yeah. And
now, if I hadn't met him, he'd probably today still have the same problem because no one would have been able to find it.
Peter, we've got some questions. We've got some questions coming.
Go right
through,
ahead.
So
Go right ahead.
It's great.
So one was.
Okay, hang on. I'll ask.
Yeah.
So Nina. So a friend of ours, Nina, she's a chief science officer for a company that does a respiratory muscle breather. But she asked about the chemical axis when you were talking about that before. What do you think is the mechanism for us sensing that? Is it feeling like the yogis, like they've felt, things and been able to map them? What do you think it might be?
Well, that's a very good question, because that is one of the key considerations in helping people through a dysfunctional habit. Okay, so she's asking a question that has days worth of answers and examples. Okay, but it's exactly the right question. She really had it. She really got it.
Without diving too deep into how to,
I'll go into it a little bit.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
okay, good.
Just get out of the way.
All right.
Okay.
Get your breathing out of the way.
Okay, it's complicated because, for instance, if you overventilate, one of the things that you can notice in a lot of people is they'll get tingling in their fingers. Just with a very small drop in CO2 level, they've got tingling. The next person, that's not true. Or they get dizzy immediately. Other people, they have to be more, have a greater deficit to feel the dizziness and so on. So now, first of all, you have a physical symptom, let's say, like, say, dizziness, all right? The next thing that one has to understand is that we have learned to respond to the dizziness. The dizziness is a trigger for other emotions and for other behaviors, like what we say. I say to myself, uh-oh, I'm losing it. I feel dizzy. I go, I'm losing control. Look what I'm saying to myself. I mean, anyone who felt like they were losing control is going to be panicky. Okay, so I feel dizzy. I feel that. Maybe the person never really ever even noticed they were dizzy. Okay, a lot of times they don't even know they get dizzy, but they know that they feel like they're losing control. Okay, so I get dizzy. It triggers. Oh my God, I say to myself, this is terrible. I won't be able to focus on what I'm doing, and I'm going to get anxious, and all these horrible things are going to happen. And then it triggers emotions, like it may be a phobic response that it triggers because of the fear of losing control. And then it may also produce disinhibition in the brain, where you may get, if you have an anger issue, it may trigger anger. And now you feel angry, you feel anxious, you feel out of control. So just take that little bit for a moment. So you have this person, the first thing they learn is that when we have them overventilate on purpose, they lose CO2 on purpose, and they start to feel like they're losing control. They start to feel angry. I remember I was doing a demonstration with a woman in a class. She was a teacher. It was a class for physiotherapists. And when she did that and we asked her how she felt, she said, I feel like picking up a stick and beating my partner over the head. That's what she said, literally. This whole group. Okay?
Wow.
So, but she hadn't focused on the dizziness. It's only, she had these feelings, you see.
Yeah.
So she could see that by breathing that way, these emotions came on. And then as I was talking with her, and she was moving into that place. I said, do you feel, because we have this checklist with all these different symptoms on it, and we look at the symptoms that they check off. And so I focus on the things that they can report. So I may say to this particular person, I may say, if you're, notice whether you're feeling dizzy right now, you see, so that the dizziness, when she can feel the dizziness, this is a woman in this case, she feels the dizziness, she knows that somehow the dizziness is connected with that anger, that fear, losing control. So what we try to do is to help her recognize the dizziness before she develops before the emotion is triggered. Or she may then learn to detect tingling in her fingers, which might come before the dizziness. So she doesn't even get dizzy. She just gets the tingling in the periphery of her body, her lips, her fingers, her feet. And she gets that first before the dizziness. After the dizziness, she gets these learned emotional responses that occur, and she understands through experience how they're connected.
So you're working it backwards. So you're like re-engineering the trigger.
Correct.
I guess you're getting to the root trigger before it.
Activating
So Peter, is the method of perturbing people through their breath useful to bring up these buried emotions?
Yes, we do it all the time, so that it depends on the person and what the dysfunctional behavior is, okay? But very often we will have the person overventilate on purpose. We'll bring the CO2 level down. We do it in a very specific way for lots of reasons I won't go into here, but we usually do it through having them slow the breath down. When they slow the breath down, they start to take larger breaths. Or I'll have them just ask them to take a little larger breath, and the breathing slows right down. And I say a little bit larger, and I can watch the CO2 level start to drop on the instrument I'm using a capnometer. And I see the CO2 dropping, and I'll say, good, you're bringing your CO2 down. Okay, a little deeper. Meanwhile, the breaths per minute might have been 18, now they're down to 6. But the chemical axis is way off the chart, and they're very dysfunctional at 6 breaths per minute. So they learn that just because they're slowing their breath down and taking deeper breaths, that's not such a great thing.
Wow, that's such a common thing, isn't it,
It's
Peter?
not good unto itself at all. So this person is in trouble now, and I'll have my, I have my checklist that they've checked off, and I have a little history on them. So I start to talk to them about that, and I'll say, does this remind you of how you feel when you're in this situation? And they'll say, oh my God, this is exactly what I feel, or whatever it is, you see. And so we go through this little guided breathing experience together, looking for symptoms, looking for memories, looking for emotions and things like that, tying it back to some previous experience, tying it into a problem that they have out there where they experience symptoms. And usually within short order, they'll say, if breathing is a problem, they'll say, I can't believe this. I mean, I'm bringing all of this on by the way I'm breathing. That's amazing. I cannot believe that. And then when they get there, they can't get back. They can't stop it. They keep breathing that way. Okay, and I've coached them into it. And then when I ask them to just breathe normally, they can't. They're right there, and they're trapped. And that's what happens to them in real life. They're trapped in it. And they can't get out. And they have all these symptoms, and they're panicked. They don't know what's going on. And they don't know what to blame it on. You see?
So having a breathing coach is beneficial because it can help navigate through these changes or transitions.
If they're educated in breathing habits, not just in breathing mechanics or respiration, right?
And that's correct. And this is what we do in our work. So it's not about teaching someone technique to make their life better. It's about uncovering these patterns and habits around breathing, how they affect you, where they came from, what triggers them, what the outcomes are that are sustaining them, what emotions they're connected with, what other conditions are exacerbating, what other conditions are triggering when they don't have to be triggered, like an epileptic seizure, and so on and so on. And so it becomes a very interesting thing. It's not just learning to breathe in a particular way that you practice day in and day out. Breathing is part of your personality. It's part of who you are. And it's an inside-out proposition. It's not about imposing some technique on your body. It's about being who you are from a breathing perspective. You develop your personality. You cultivate who you are physiologically, psychologically, one and the same. You cultivate them.
And so so your breathing is woven through all of those. It's it's the main, I guess it's the main mechanism of it's the problem, also the solution. is that
very often? And the behavior, and breathing is a behavior. It's always going on, you know.
Right.
So it mixes in with everything. And sometimes breathing is the problem and a bad solution. Here's an example. Someone is overventilating all day long. They have stress all day long in their company, and to get control, they take over the breathing because they feel better. They hold their breath. They do whatever they do. They control it, and they feel less anxiety. They feel more contained, less out of control. Okay, and they do this all day long. And what happens is that the pH goes amok. Generally, you overbreathe, the pH gets too high, you become too alkaline very, very quickly. In a matter of seconds, you become too alkaline. But the person's doing it all day long, okay? And what happens is the kidneys will compensate. And they will dump out bicarbonates that normally regulate the, the lactic acid and other kinds of things in the blood plasma, okay? So that the bicarbonates that you need to buffer acids with, you urinate them out. So over a period of days or weeks, you end up compromising your buffer supply. So now you don't have enough buffer, bicarbonate, to deal with the lactic acid that you're generating during the day. So now when you go to the grocery store and shop, or you walk around, you feel exhausted. Wow. You're at work, you feel exhausted. You've compromised your buffer supply.
Wow.
And now when you get lactic acid production, and now you don't have enough buffers, so you go into lactic acidosis. There's a reflex that operates to protect you. And you know what it is? It's to hyperventilate.
Oh, wow.
It's to do what you're already doing. You know, so your body kicks in the mechanism to bring the pH back up to normal.
Wow.
Not that it can, but it works in that direction. So that if you're acidic, you're not really acidic, you're less alkaline, you're in lactic acidosis, you overventilate to reduce the carbon dioxide level, which reduces the carbonic acid level, which then works in the direction of restoring normal pH. But that's the cause of the problem in the first place. The body's solution is the very behavior that brought about the problem in the first place because of your need to control.
What's one thing? So listening to all of that, like you hear the loops and spirals that we're getting.
Right.
It is observing your breathing the kind of the place to start. Like what would be?
Yes. Awareness is where it all has to begin.
Right.
There's no way you can, for instance, I don't know whether you have a dysfunctional problem unless you're aware of it. When I work with you, I don't look at you and say, look, Shane, you have this dysfunctional breathing habit. When I work with you, you discover it. I help you find it, and then I know it through your own discovery process.
Right.
And the awareness is fundamental to overcoming any dysfunctional habit.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what it is.
Cool.
Yes. Yeah. I've gotten so much out of this. In fact, I'm looking at some of the comments here. Lots of takeaways. Great access training.
We are probably going to have to do some more of this again.
We might need to do another one of these. Yes.
We have got another
Sure.
another one.
Sure, anytime.
Peter, thank you so much for
Sure,
coming
you're
on.
welcome.
Where can people find you if they want to follow you and things like that? Where's the best place to find you?
Well, first of all, my email, which is extremely simple.
I know, I love it.
It's my two initials, Peter Litchfield, PL, at and then there's just 2 letters, B as in Bravo, P as in physiology. Okay, so
Right.
BP is really behavioral physiology, breathing physiology.
You have been studying behavior and people for a while, haven't you? Make it simple.
BP and then dot EDU.
Cool. Great. We'll put that in the
EDU.
link. We'll also link that in.
And where can they find
me
out
there.
about? Where can they find out?
I can send you. I'll send you an article, which I think might be very helpful.
Perfect.
Oh, yes.
Where people can get the gist of what this is about, and how traditional kinds of breath work, can go wrong.
Wow, that would be amazing.
And things to add to what you're doing if you're doing breath work, to bring together the chemistry of respiration and the mechanics of breathing.
Yeah, that obviously that's what we're extremely fascinated with, which is one of the main reasons why we got you on to have this interview today, is because it is extremely freeing to know that what I thought was a mental disorder is a breathing disorder.
Or combination, but also Peter, for me, because there is breath work is like it seems to be having its day and coming up and becoming very popular. So Angie and I feel that being in this field and being leaders in this field, that we want to make sure that people are educated the right way, that they're
it's important. Yeah, it's very important. Be educated.
Yeah, that it's not just about huffing and puffing and and things like that.
Right. There's much more to it. It's a very psychological thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not just a physical thing. And you can't understand breathing unless you get into the psychology of it.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I agree with you. And that's really, like, I think if I were to share what my main takeaways have been, it's been, 1, allowing people to find what their own breathing disorder is. 2 has been around connecting with being able to connect with the axis. And being able to center with that. So it's a constant thing, which that resonated with me so very much, because I feel like I do that a lot, and I know that I can dive a whole lot deeper into it, but I feel like for me, I know when my energy's starting to rise in my body and I'm feeling out of control, or those, alarm bells start going off, then I'm like, okay, well, what can I do what does my breath want to do to help compensate for this? And that's been quite helpful. And I think for me also, another one is that, how your breathing can cause problems, but also be the very thing that you need to let go of the issues. So it's like, what you resist persists. So by bringing the awareness to your breathing mechanism, as well as understanding breathing physiology, can bring a lot of freedom to behavioral change and being
absolutely
able to
navigate
transitional
and the breathing becomes a metaphor for all kinds of other physiology.
Oh yeah. Yes.
See? Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I hear you.
Peter, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
We are going to have you back on again, because there's a lot more that I want to talk about.
Shane could literally spend all day with you, Peter.
Yes.
So
I will.
We'll keep this to a specific time.
Okay.
We'll get you on again.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We'll put the link to your email in the comments and stuff. And thanks everyone for watching on Facebook as well. We had some great questions. So
thank you so much, Peter.
Thanks,
You're
Peter.
welcome. Well, thank you, Angie. Thanks you, Shane.
Thanks. See ya.